So much for joining us. Welcome to the second day of the Miu Miu Literary Club. We have an amazing day prepared for you. We'll have musical performances, we'll have DJs, and more. But first, we're going to kick things off with a panel inspired by the great Italian author and feminist Sibilla Aleramo, the author of, among other things, Una Donna, or A Woman. Now, if you haven't heard of Sibilla before, don't worry. Sibilla wrote about issues that are familiar to women all over the world. They might even be familiar to you in your own life. Questions about what it means to be a woman. What does it mean to experience sisterhood, family, love, desire, lust, feminism, you know, like all the good, juicy things that make life exciting. And she was doing this not in the 2020s, not the 90s, not the 80s, not the 70s or 60s. She was doing this in 1906. So when I say Sibilla was ahead of her time, I really mean she was well ahead of her time. We are joined by a truly astounding panel of authors today to discuss these themes. They are Selby Wynn Schwartz, who was longlisted for the Booker Prize for her novel After Sappho, Viola Di Grado, the author of Blue Hunger and 70% Acrylic 30% Wool, which won the Premio Campiello Opera Prima Literary Prize when she was just 23. Apologies to any Italians if I butchered the name of that prize. And Xiaolu Guo, the novelist, filmmaker, and author of Radical, who was once named one of Granta's best young British novelists. Please put your hands together for our panelists. But before we sit down and pick their brains, we're going to welcome the great actress, Bel Powley. Bel is going to read us an extract from Una Donna.
Did I belong to this man now? It must have been love that was behind it all. And how ill-prepared I was to receive that mysterious visitor. And how little I really knew about life. Next to nothing, in the end. Having focused so exclusively and for so long upon my father, I'd never stopped to imagine my future life as a woman. And so it was that I had become one. In this way, I became subject to the will of my husband. In truth, beyond the degree of energy expected in caring for my child, there was little left, and an increasing incapacity to see, to desire anything, to live. Like a mental fatigue that overlay the physical one, a dissatisfaction with myself, a self-criticism from the better self that I had neglected, from the deepest and sincerest part of myself that I had repressed and masked for so long. It wasn't an illness, it was the sense of the fundamental deficiency of my life wanting to be heard. The mother in me could not be reconciled with the whole woman. But the good mother must not be, as I had been, a one-dimensional self-sacrificing creature. She must be a woman, a human being. One day, after reading a news story about an incident in the provincial capital, I felt compelled to write a short piece of my own in response to it and sent it to a newspaper in Rome. It was accepted for publication. The piece included the word feminism, and when I saw it in print there, the acerbic-sounding word seemed suddenly to take on its full meaning, signifying for me nothing less than a new ideal. Some weeks later, my husband came home from work, worried about something. That day, I had received an invitation from a famous female writer to contribute to a women's periodical that she was about to launch, and that had been commissioned by a new publishing house. I was being offered a modest fee, and I'd hoped that his mood would lighten on hearing about it. On the contrary, he indicated that I should keep quiet. My husband looked for the publication containing my article and, together with certain complimentary letters, both old and new, flung it into the fireplace, followed by a pile of newspapers and magazines. Then he began urgently rifling through the rest of my papers. I remember the incident now as one of the worst but most significant in my life, epitomizing as it does the incredible pettiness of the man that I was yoked to. And seeing how alone and utterly divided I was in spirit, I felt the king of shiver run through me that is provoked by certain sights in which the grotesque and the sublime are inextricably intertwined. Once the panic was over, I continued to write and publish. I was starting to be the recipient of echoes of my own ideas in both letters and articles. My past now appeared to have been ordained by a ruthlessly omniscient will. Did not everything seem to have been placed, in effect, as preparation for a particular future? And yet, I could not make that future out. And without a clear direction, my efforts seemed to be proceeding in a chaotic fashion. What did I wish to become? Not a journalist. I was beginning to feel the almost complete futility of scattering half-baked ideas. Did I want to be an artist? I didn't dare to presume, keenly aware as I was of my lack of culture, of inventiveness, of a sufficiently developed aesthetic sense. A book. The book. I didn't imagine that I could write it. Not I. But I sometimes tormented myself by thinking of the book that needed to be written, a book about love and sorrow that would be both harrowing and inspirational, relentless and compassionate, that would show for the first time what it was really like to be a woman now, and that for the first time would inspire in those unhappy brothers of ours, men, both remorse for the past and desire for a better future. A book able to translate into print the ideas that have been fermenting chaotically in me for the past 2 years, and that would be passionately articulate. Would it ever be written? By anyone? Was there a woman in the world who had suffered what I had suffered, who had received from both animate and inanimate things the lessons I had received, and who would know how to extract the essence from such an experience, to create the masterpiece that could properly represent a life? Thanks.
Thank you so much for that, Bel. I hope that's whetted your appetite to read more Sibilla. We have a very special present for you. On your seat is a copy of Una Donna for you to take home. But before you get stuck into it, I know some of you are already picking it up and starting to read it. Hold your horses, because we still have our panel ready and waiting for you. Now, I've got so much I want to ask you guys. But first, a bit of housekeeping. There will be 15 minutes at the end for any questions you have. So if there's something that comes up in the middle of this conversation that you're just dying to ask, hold on to it. We've got people with roving mics on either side of the room. If you raise your hand, we will get those mics over to you at the end of the conversation. Okay, with that in mind, all the admin done, Selby, let's start with you. So After Sappho features a chorus of historical women's voices and their stories, and one of them is actually Sibilla herself. So can you tell us a bit about what you learned while researching her life for this novel? What drew you to including her in it, as well as her real-life lover, Lina Paletti?
Maybe I should start by saying how I encountered Sibilla Aleramo. So I encountered Sibilla Aleramo, maybe like other people in this room, in school, when I was getting a doctorate in comparative literature at the University of California, Berkeley, and I took a class in the scrittrici del Novecento, the women writers of the 20th century. And so we read all of the writers that one reads in that category, Alba de Céspedes also, and Renata Vigano, also the Partigiana. And I read Sibilla Aleramo, and I was very taken by the depth of emotion in her language, the way that she uses these very strong key words, like the word for chain, like catena and incatenarsi, and the way she uses this verb impadronirsi, which is like to overmaster, to take possession of, to padronate. It's not a word in English, but to become the patron and the proprietor and the master and the father and the owner, and that kind of the strength of that language and the strength of her story, including, thank you, the part that you read, the surviving of sexual violence when she's very young, and her determination to become someone who does not merely submit, who does not give up, who does not sort of allow herself to be passive in the chains that she inherits from her mother, that she inherits from her culture, that she inherits from her time. And so that was many years ago when I learned of Sibilla Aleramo. But at that time, all of the things I learned about the writers, the scrittrici, the women writers of the Novecento, I learned many lovely things, but I'd never learned anything about a person called Lina Poletti, who was also a writer, also a woman writer, who was in her time a singular person, a poet, a playwright. She was fairly openly queer for her time. She was very ambitious. She wanted to go to university. She wanted to study. She wanted to do things with her life that were not merely to be a good girl and get married and not say anything. And she had a relationship with Sibilla Aleramo. For a time, they met in a feminist conference, if people are looking for pickup tips. Yes, they met in a feminist gathering, conference, and were together for a part of their lives. And then Lina Poletti was also with the very famous actress Eleonora Duse. So it wasn't like Lina Poletti was or I should have known who Lina Poletti was. Someone should have told me about Lina Poletti. And I don't know if we had a test in this room about how many people learned in school about Lina Poletti, but my guess is maybe no one. So at least I'm not alone. I'm not alone. We didn't know about Lina Poletti until now. But when I discovered Lina Poletti much, much later, only a few years ago, I wanted there to be a story about her. And there's not really. I mean, there's a couple chapters in a book and a few articles, and I felt maybe a little bit like the part that you read is from Una Donna. Sometimes if there's a book that has to be in the world, you might have to make it yourself, which is sad if you wanted just to be a reader, but it's a way to find a kind of fierce reason for writing.
Yeah, if any novelists or authors are here tonight and are thinking of looking for their next source of inspiration, maybe Lina Poletti could be someone who sparks interest. She's yours.
Yes, exactly.
Now, Xiaolu, I want to come to you. So your memoir, Radical, critiques, society's expectations of women as mothers, which is pointed out in the extract that Bel so beautifully read. It's also about your own personal search for freedom, like an identity beyond just being a caregiver. And, it's something Sibilla still was writing about a century ago, more than a century ago. Why do you think these social norms are still with us all these decades later?
Thanks so much, Zing, for such a question. And I have to thank Olga. Actually, I didn't know this author, Una Donna, this book, until 2 months ago when the organization contacted me to be here. And I began to read about her and I read A Women. And I think the prose was instant. The first page was so direct, so strong. And I read in, of course, English translation. The translation is wonderfully powerful. So I can only imagine the Italian origin will be even more powerful or equally, if it's not very different. And I think, for your question, I think this immediate, it's almost like this inherited depression as a second sex, which we carry. And especially, I think, in her book, A Women, this young motherhood, this trapped, this traditional role for her to break through. And in her case, it's much more radical gender-wise. She became neutral. I don't know how to describe her situation when she shifted that to another world. And in her own life, she's so radical, this both places. And I thought about, this is so connected to our kind of writing. All of us here, I think, share this kind of physical pain and physical joy when we try to go further. And in my radical, I think I talked about that more from a foreigner's point of view. A Chinese person left my second country, which was Britain, went to the US to be in New York to explore a sort of possible freedom in a third country. But I think these days the idea of immigration is so different from, in her days, late 19th century, she moved to eventually move around, and with women, with men, and I think, but our situation is exactly the same, the convention, the tradition, and I think also the moral trap I inherited, and also I think it's in her prose as well. And her prose also brought me back the whole almost European, this feministic tradition. I immediately thought of her contemporary, like George Sand. I think George Sand is a French version of her in a way. George Sand had a child when she was 18, was very young, and then she had 2 children after a few years. And this kind of, supposed traditional George Sand began to become she and him, double sex. And I remember Victor Hugo was confused by George Sand's sexuality, but he respected her, or in these days we say they, this concept of they, he respected so much of George Sand's transition as both man and woman. And also I felt very close to, very intimate to her prose in A Women. It reminds me of the author I really love, a Brazilian woman writer, Clarice Lispector, and especially in her Life Aqua, the prose is so intensely, really fresh and beautiful and painful. And in her case, I think I thought about the later generation, for example, the Italian feminist author Natalia Ginsburg. In Natalia Ginsburg, it's almost more together, more coherent, but like more made feminist reflection. And in her work, it's this kind of very primitive, powerful, this painful rendering of her trouble from early years. I think it's intellectually, emotionally, really first-rate writing.
Yeah, it's so authentic and true that when you read it, you almost feel like, oh, this woman was writing yesterday. She wasn't writing in like 1906. And one of the things she really writes about is this whole idea of the mother-daughter relationship and of starting a family. And Viola, you've written about that relationship in 70% acrylic, 30% wool. You return to it again and again in your books, like in Hollow Heart or Iron Children, which is an incredible novel where motherhood is now the preserve of androids. So how do you think motherhood can really fit into the life of an emancipated woman? Do we need to redefine what it means, like the people in Japan in your novel, Iron Children?
Yeah, no, I mean, this is an interesting question, and of course, we could talk about this so much. There's so much to say. And also, as an Italian, I always feel every time I get asked about motherhood, because I get asked about it a lot because it features in my novel for some reason. And every time I feel like I need to somehow make it political, which I don't intend to when I write about it, but it's like, as a female writer writing in Italian, I have to somehow make it political when I'm talking about it, which is not when I'm writing about it. So it's just a second stage, which is really different. And because I am Italian and I will always be Italian, even though I live in London, even though I've lived everywhere, but of course I will always be Italian. And I think that's mainly because I write in Italian. I think that's the mostly part. The most important part of it. And the thing is, now in Italy, it's so, I don't know if you heard, but now they just approved this new thing about, the so-called pro-life movement, people being allowed to be in the room where, a woman is going ahead or trying to go ahead with an abortion. And so, of course, it's like in Italy, when you talk about motherhood, you always have to think about what is happening around motherhood. You have to think about how the government is trying to say to women all the time, make children, make children. And then I think, you mentioned my book, Bambini di Ferro, where, yes, it's a very strange book, but at the same time, it's not strange at all, because metaphorically, it's very similar to a lot of things that actually could happen in the future. So basically, the novel is set in Japan and in a near future where the government is very rationally thinking, how can we make better adults who are more productive in the society and not unhappy like so many adults are. And so they just build these, robot mothers to make the perfect mothers. And it's weird how there's like so much emphasis on Italy now on making children. Like you have to make children, but then what happens next? It's like you feel forced to make children, and then what happens to the children? And so, of course, we should shift the attention somewhere else, because we have to think about the children's rights, what happens to the children, and because we are not just machines making children for the state, of course. And so we need to work on making, on the children's rights. We need to work on, for example, the rights of children who were born from two mothers, like, you know what I mean, like, or two fathers, like you have two mothers or two fathers, and in Italy there's a huge gap in terms of rights, and so I think that's where the emphasis should be. And so this is just to say, I think it's really interesting that when you write, you're in a space when you're just thinking about, like when I write about mothers and daughters, I'm thinking about the kind of love which is like unconditional. And so I of course, I think about love a lot when I write, because everything is connected to love. When you write about love, death, life. That's all the novels talk about that. But then you are with people in talks, and so you need to think about what is motherhood now, what needs to be. And I think that's really interesting how the writing shifts, and it's like you have to take a responsibility, which I think is really important, like it's as a woman, as a female writer, to also carry this responsibility, to think all the time, what can I use do I only use my writing like for the writing, or can I somehow use it to say very specific things that can help people making their own minds about what should happen and what we need to think about.
I love the description of novel writing as like love, death, life. That's simple. It's simple. Anyone can do it. Anyone can become a novelist. So it's interesting you also mention, trying to come up with this like language of, trying to make yourself understood and like heard, and whether there's a message or a political message in it. And, Selby and Viola, you both work with the works of other female authors. So, you've translated people like Patricia Highsmith. You've obviously interpreted the voices of other female authors like Sappho, like Sibilla. Do you feel a kind of responsibility to depicting those voices accurately and truthfully? Or do you feel like the work of fiction is more to explore what possibilities those authors offer?
You go first.
Oh, okay. Well, I guess in that case, I should say first. I mean, I think that translating, which I can't do and I don't do, is an art that is under-recognized, and I admire from a great distance those who practice the art of translation, the arts of translation. But I do think, in this language of responsibility and political responsibility, and perhaps particularly feminist responsibility, I do, even when fictionalizing, feel that at least there's an ethics. And I think about the work of Sarah Ahmed, which I read quite a bit, and I admire her way of thinking about. She says in one part that citations are feminist bricks, like they're a way of building, and you're building back, and you're honoring when you're doing that, and you're building something new. It's not just a dead citation that sits, dead at the bottom of the page. It's a way of saying, I acknowledge that I could not have done this by myself. I come from a lineage of thinking. I am indebted to people who think with me, who think around me, who have thought before me, who have written before me, who have created things that have without which I couldn't build whatever it is I can build. And so I guess I think of that as the ethics of handling the material, the texts, the voices of others. Even if I'm reimagining, I try to keep in mind that kind of ethics so that what I'm doing, I hope, at least, is an attempt to honor and not an attempt to transform in some way that is, even if it's untrue in the sense that it's reimagined, it's fictionalized, but to not be untrue to the spirit.
And what about you, Viola, as a translator? Do you see your role as just being, the empty vessel through which the original author's voice can come through?
Actually, I think about it a lot, of course, and I don't feel like an empty vessel. I feel like I love translating. It's like one of my favorite. Like I think it's my second favorite things, like after writing, because to me it's like writing without writing, because you get the inventiveness of writing, but it's like inside a perimeter that it's the author's mind, and so it's more playful. And so more than an empty vessel, I feel like I am myself as an author, but working for someone else. So I use my means as a writer, my brain, my technical skill, my voice, to convey something as close as possible to what the author is saying. And it is immensely creative, so I don't really feel the emptiness there. And there's also a huge creativity. You mentioned Patricia Highsmith. So when I was translating her diaries, it was, of course, I felt an immense responsibility, and because it's her whole life in diaries, and so I got to spend so much time with her and inside her mind, and just seeing her change so much, like a human being changes throughout their life. And there was also a lot of, you know what they say about Patricia Highsmith, so that sometimes she sounded like racist, that sometimes, and so the curator of the diaries, the original curator, decided not to censor anything. And so, of course, when I was translating that, I was also kind of interacting with that, like with those kind of thoughts. And of course, as a translator, I also had to ask myself every time, what am I conveying? What am I choosing to, maybe not censor, but like change slightly? Because, of course, the thing is, as a translator, you are in charge of making this shift between the original voice and your voice in your language. And when you make this shift, you have to take into consideration that every language has its own, its own barriers, its own kind of shapes. So it's like, even if something sounds in a way in the first language, it doesn't mean, maybe it sounds more violent in Italian, or the opposite, so the whole thing, so even if the curator already decided about what to leave, what to not leave, I have to make the choice again. Because, sometimes, violence is really, sometimes it's more apparent in a language than in another, because, of course, every language is different. And everything changes, the tone changes in every language. I think it's really interesting how a book changes from a language to another. And it was really strange for me, because, of course, I started feeling this affection. Like, I felt I was really in a relationship with Patricia Highsmith, because I spent more than a year with her, and it was a year for me, but it was a lifetime for her. It's like her whole diaries, and I tried to respect her like the most. And so I don't think I didn't want to leave anything out of it, because I wanted to pay homage to this life, because I was dealing with a whole life. This is, I think,
Yeah, and Patricia Highsmith, for those of you who haven't heard of her, she's the author of The Talented Mr. Ripley. So if you know, there's this new Netflix series called Ripley that's based on the novels that she wrote. It's an amazing book series, an amazing series as well on television. And Xiaolu, we talk about responsibility, but you also write, memoirs. So there's a responsibility, maybe you feel differently to real life living people in your own life. How do you navigate that responsibility? Sibilla was writing in Una Donna about a fictional protagonist, but it was actually her own life that she was basing a lot of it on. So how do you negotiate that? Do you feel like you have to be accurate to the people you're writing about?
Yes, I mean, that's how I immediately react to the book in such a, I think, a natural, automatic way. And I recognize a lot of difficulties in Una Donna because I guess in modern days, the publisher will say that's autofiction or autobiographical memoir. But in olden days, you have to replace all the names, and it is slowly kind of surrender to the form of fiction, for better or for worse. And I think my dealing with womanhood, the female material, physically and emotionally and intellectually, I think went through, again, the deep translation process, I think you both talk about. I mean, I don't mean the linguistic translation. I find linguistic translation is the final technical expression, require a lot of intellectual abilities, but I'm talking about deeper translation, which is something like Schopenhauer said, the deepest translation is translation of the self. And I did teach a course called Translating the Self in Berlin, actually. For a whole year, I'm talking about how do we translate the self, especially to translate a person ontologically suppressed, verbally inexpressible, or our verbal existence is so censored, or in certain religion sense, we are not allowed to express that. And how do we translate that into a literary work like Una Donna, or my kind of book, say, Radical, or the last novel called A Lover's Discourse, or Once Upon a Time in the East. That's my first memoir. And I hate to say those are memoirs because it's a made intellectual product, as if they were memoirs after you are dying or you died. But all the life writing are auto writing. It's this quotation from, I think it's Coetzee, James Coetzee, the South African writer. He said, what? Autofiction? I mean, that's a techie, overused American word. Every fiction is auteur's fiction. It's we are the auteur doing the fiction. And eventually become autofiction. It seems to be very commercialized. New York Times, New Yorker word, but we are auteur's fiction. And in a sense, like the superficial moralistic question is, how should we not hurt to the people we know? Mm-hmm. How should we, or if you're amoralist like me, I'm just hopelessly against the idea of putting that above all in the book. I think I can be quite bad in my book. And I think I really kind of retreat a bit and looking at the materials, could be my life material, which is a transition from China. Grew up in a very communistic but intellectual family, writing in Chinese for my 30 years of my life, published in Chinese, 10 books. And that is very late for me to translate or transit to an Anglophone world, which I began to write in English when I was 30 years old, after publishing all in Chinese. And I think that transition is it's kind of deep, painful, intellectual translation of the self. And it's again, I think, echoing back to the beginning of this beautiful reading. I think you read the bit, what a book. She could, as a character, she couldn't imagine, Selby couldn't imagine this would be the book form. And I think that is a process for a woman or a child or a young writer to discover. This is a process your physical reality would render into, transit into artistic expression. And the book is a format that actually allow you to go away from that painful or tedious or wonderful reality, become something slightly abstract or metaphysically powerful. And in her case, she rendered it so well, but regardless, she preserves that primitive material in such a beautiful way. And perhaps in some other male authors, those physical feeling, they become more abstract. Say, in Roland Barthes' work, which I love, and I wrote a novel called the lover's discourse after battle. You know, his physical reality completely withdrawn or completely disappeared in his own writing. It becomes something else. It's to do with sensuality in an abstract way. But I think that is a translation process. How do we render self into a much more deeper self rather than this superficial self who will lay down fragments of, you know, the trivial kind of moments. And maybe they are beautiful, but it's difficult to somehow take yourself away from that pool of the mass. And I think exactly like her, she becomes such a radical feminist in her own sexual life and in her own anti-fascist way.
Yeah.
And I think that's the intellectual power you managed from that translation and transition of the self.
Yeah, I love what you said about, you know, it's about translating the self. And obviously, you know, she was writing at the turn of the 20th century, trying to understand her own life. And I was wondering, you know, we'll start with you, Selby. What do you think we in 2024 have to learn from someone writing all those years ago? You know, is it a matter of identifying with the self that she's created in books, or are there, you know, or is it quite easy to do that now?
I think maybe I'll answer the question in a slightly different direction, but it has to do with this space. Actually in the part that you read, I know we're all referring to it, but thank you. It's like a well. She starts talking about the possibilities of having a career as a writer. What is it like? How do you start? What are the actual physical risks? And she mentions, you know, that there's been this possibility extended to her from a circle of feminist writers, without whom she would not really, I think, have been able to become Sibilla Aleramo, which is a name that she took, you know, that was in part given to her and in part she chose. So I think about one of the people who was in that extended circle of feminist writers and editors and activists was Anna Kuleshov, who was a Ukrainian-born feminist who in 1890 in the Circolo Filologico di Milano, where we are, gave a talk to a group of people, and it was called Il Monopolio dell'Uomo, the monopoly of man, like capital M, man. Capital M, anyway, yes, so the monopoly of man. And it was in part because of this sort of, I guess I'm thinking about the backstory, that it was in part because of Anna Kuleshov and these circles, these constellations, these networks. Some names are famous and some names are not so famous, but it was part of the network of feminists who said, yes, I will take your article. Yes, you can come and work here. Yes, I recognize you as a writer. Yes, I will entrust you the editorship of this journal. Yes, I know you haven't published anything, but that doesn't mean you are worth nothing. Don't give up just because your papers have been thrown in the fire by an abusive partner. I think about the fact that maybe that's something that we can keep learning. And I don't know, as a person, as an activist, also, Viola, you were speaking about, you know, the responsibilities that we have in a political sense afterwards. When I wrote this book also, I thought a lot about Nonno di Meno and about Italian transfeminism as something that inspires me a great deal. And so I think about, you know, in the time of Anna Kuleshov in 1890, the words intersectional transfeminism were not part of the discourse, but they are now, and it's just another way of saying, I think, something that I try to remember, that I hope that we keep working towards.
So you're saying that sitting here right now, we're actually in the same venue as an Italian feminist who 100+ years ago delivered a talk about the monopoly of man.
Benvenuti, benvenute, benvenuto.
I mean, you call that full circle. I hope in 100 years there'll be another gathering of people here to discuss, hopefully not the monopoly of men, hopefully that will have ended.
Yes,
but
we'll have a party
else.
instead. We'll have a big celebration, it's all over.
Yeah. Viola, what about you? You know, do you think that we have so much to learn still from these women who lived, you know, 150 years ago? You know, what do you think we can learn from them?
We do have so much to learn. First, because I don't think there's been such a huge change, unfortunately. So we still need to catch up so much for equality, and so it is necessary to read this female writer. And also, I think if you look at female writers from the past, you always find this sort of urge that is really mesmerizing, because it's this magical force in the writing that comes precisely from not being allowed to write. And it's basically, it's a superpower, because that's what makes this novel so powerful, that the rage, the rage to be heard. I'm thinking of the first ever novelist in the world, which was Murasaki Shikibu. She was a Japanese courtesan in the year 1000. And back then in Japan, it's always the same story. Only men were allowed to write, and they were writing in Chinese, and that was the official language. And so what she did is just, she started writing, and she didn't know Chinese, because of course women couldn't study, and so she just used Japanese. And so this all goes back to the whole thing of how political it is, how rebellious, how great. Like, she literally started to write a novel. This novel is a great novel. It's still a great novel in 2024. And that you don't even need to contextualize to appreciate, because it's just great. And she did it out of that state of mind, out of that feeling of frustration of not being able to study the proper language that men were using. And so doing that, she doesn't only write the words first novel or first psychological novel, which for me is the same thing, because a novel has to be psychological. But she also uses a different language. She dignifies this language. So the language of the people, the language of the women, the language that you didn't have to be taught, because it was the language that you grew up with. So it was the language of their emotions.
That's so interesting. I love that you mentioned her, because she's an incredible novelist. And there are some novels that are very historical. You read them and you're like, oh, do I have to read this? It's very entertaining. That is one of the great things about it. You're like, the first novel was a fun read.
Yeah.
And it's rare. Xiaolu, what about you? Do you think we've got so much still to learn from all these women who were writing all these centuries ago? Do you have a famous, significant, inspiring novelist that you return to time and time again?
Oh, sure, yeah, absolutely. I mean, when I was reading Una Donna, I thought about maybe these books belong to the kind of pre-modernist time. I think Virginia Woolf wrote very differently to The Lighthouse, Waves, A Woman's Own Room. I think, but it's totally continuous voice from women looking for its own space and freedom. And this is published before the 1920s, so 1900, around that time. And I think her time it's almost like this, the living museum, the living archive for the modernist or for the feminist to study. This is our flesh, our, basically lived kind of pain and misery and struggle as these strong women, but who couldn't have ready-made identity yet. There's no such vocabulary, lesbian, feminist, or they, or neutral gender, And I thought very interestingly, compared to the American scholar, American feminist theorist, Judith Butler, and her theory about gender is performative. And I thought this text is so much about how women perform her behavior as mother, as a wife, later on as women abandoning her family and become someone else. She's performing those possibilities, but somehow already it's beyond her performance, is in her seemingly automatic, but actually she performed it for the social norm, for the convention. And it's really, I read as kind of a text for Judith Butler's kind of theory, how the womanhood is being performed, rather than, as if we learn later on. Therefore, I think it's a continued kind of text, for women and for most writers to study our behavior or to study our kind of non-free this agency in this totally wrapped bound, kind of full of limits. This reality. How do we perform our roles? And this novel really just shows, all the codes and all the convention, all the wild desire, this person tried to break or perform. And it's always there, I think, for you to refer to if you live very postmodernly these days, or live very neutrally or very plastically, And this is embedded in our life, generations.
Yeah, what's that quote? I can't remember who says it. What? We're born naked, the rest is drag. Sums it up perfectly. So I think we're going to come to questions now. Remember, we've got people on either side with mics, so you have a question, just raise your hand and ask. Yes, in the front row.
Thank you so much for this beautiful talk. Is this working? Yes.
Yes.
Hi. Hello, everyone. Sibilla Aleramo was also famous for having literary exchanges through letters with a lot of contemporary writers, men and women. And I'd love to know from you, which is your relation with the community of women writers around you during your creative process. Do you have the occasion to talk to them, to read to them what you're writing, to collect advices, and how does it work? They always talk about tough love among writers. Is it true? Do you have this kind of feeling?
I see you're smiling, Selby.
Oh, yeah, no. I mean, I don't know if someone has experiences of tough love. I would say I have been really fortunate in my life. I was smiling because I was thinking, what a meta thing to say, Olga. Like, here we are in company, and for me, it's a great pleasure to be in this conversation with you. So I felt like in a way, I'm performing what is actually happening in your question, which is, what is it like to have a community of thinkers and feminists and writers to be in conversation with? It's like this, and it's lovely. Thank you.
Viola?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. It's lovely when we manage to create these spaces. It's not always easy, but it would be wonderful to have them more often.
Yeah, note to Miu Miu. Do it more often.
I guess for me, I think it's first, funnily, because I didn't meet you guys, but I read your books before. And so it's more intellectual kind of integrity. I read After Sappho before I met you a year ago, and I thought about, it's great that the reference in this book is totally the stuff, the humans I love. I hold on to them, those references in your book. And I read Viola's novel, I thought, the way you approach to the material world is so cool. And I think it's more intellectually, I find it very warming and encouraging to go ahead. And sometimes I don't need the physical, it's funny, I don't very much need this physical contact because I find the intellectual power is stronger. And then when I was writing Radical, my other books, constantly those books are on my bedside, old Virginia Woolf, and Catherine Mansfield, or a lot of Asian literature, or Roland Barthes, or even Nietzsche. I'm not pretending, but they are like my intellectual friends, died long ago. And I found that's really powerful. I do think you write with those invisible friends, in your head, and they can be really sustaining for you,
Yeah, it's kind of like what you said about citations being not just, an annoying thing you have to do at the end of a university essay, but building on top of,
as you just said, yeah.
Yeah, building on top of a community of people whose work came before you. I love that. Do we have another question? Yes, over there.
Thank you so much for this wonderful and insightful conversation. Sibilla Aleramo had to find her own place in order to pursue her career and to find a way to express her subjectivity and voice also abandoning and leaving her own town in Marche and moving to Rome and to Milan and then also to Paris. And there she translated and she found her group of networks and connections, as you mentioned, because all of you actually had to deal with different countries and languages because you moved abroad or because you studied other literatures and languages and you translated, as you mentioned. So I was wondering, how does moving across borders, countries, languages shape your identity of writers or of individuals and women, if you want?
Xiaolu, I think you've made the biggest journey.
It's a very complex question, including 10 more questions. Yeah, I mean, very tough question. I think the identity is really an interesting thing. You know, when you never leave a place, I didn't think I wonder about the identity as Chinese when I lived in China, even though I was a rebel, very punk, very kind of disagreeable youth. But I never really questioned my own identity. The only kind of opposition was the older generations or my father's communist generation. And I questioned myself, am I a Marxist or post-Marxist, or am I still a peasant's daughter? I mean, those are the identity within you are challenging. But when I left for Britain, suddenly become, the linguistic anxiety and anxiety for my own existence, my own identity as an artist, rather than as a woman or as an Asian, that become very enormous. And I wondered what I do with my life, beyond all this crisis. I think it's very useful and very tough to change your linguistic environment and become an immigrant. It's a really huge lesson to learn. Most time positive, but the hardship you're going through, like Viola going to Asia to lived there, I think it's just it's an enormous challenge for your discomfort from the past. I do think that affect your writing, your way of thinking a lot.
Viola, what about you? Because you moved to Japan, didn't you?
Yeah. I lived there for a while, and in China as well. In many places in Scandinavia, and I've lived really in many places. And I think, for me, I think about this a lot, obviously, and I think what I was doing, I always say about myself that I feel like I'm more a writer than a person, and this is how I truly feel, and this is one good example, that actually what I was trying to do, and I think successfully doing in moving to so many places, was precisely trying to erase as much as possible my identity. I didn't want my identity. It's like, do you know how they all say, like, go and find yourself? I didn't want to find myself. I wanted to lose myself, And I think this has to do a lot with me identifying with my nature as a writer more than my nature as a human being, although it may seem a bit extreme, but that's how I feel. That it's like I had this, like since I was a child, it's like I was writing everything, and I was so involved in my mission, in writing, much more than my mission as, a growing human being in the world. And I found that this really suited me, this moving, around in so many places, because in every place you get the chance to create some sort of distance between yourself and yourself. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And this is essential, I think, for a writer, to try to look at yourself, so at the world, which is the same thing, from a distance. Because we also this also applies to language, because we are born inside language. And so what can we do about it? I mean, as writers, we need to think about language a lot. We need to use it as precisely as possible, but how can you do that if you are born inside this thing called language? And I think the way I was doing this was by not only moving to many places, but also learning languages like Chinese, Japanese, that were so far and different from mine, because that's how you get to build that distance because you don't only learn a language, you learn how people think inside the language, so how people are inside the language. And that way, as a writer, you can think better about how you are inside your own language and inside the world.
Yeah, Selby, you're nodding. I know you also learned Italian as well because you were born speaking English.
Yeah, no, I think I was nodding because I agree with everything that you just said, and I like very much the way you expressed it so precisely in the shapes of language that we have. And I know I was just nodding because I think it's you said it so beautifully, the idea about taking distance and then the space of encounter, but maybe above all the idea of shape, like that we're born into language, yes, and that has a shape, and that we fill out that shape, but that shape is also around us. And I was thinking about the way that you were both speaking about, maybe in a sort of gestural way, almost like, that you're kind of like it's almost like you're elbowing around in that space, and so the space of language is changing around you, and sometimes you reach right through the membrane of language, and there's a kind of encounter or osmosis or transmission, or you change, perhaps, I don't know, you specifically change the shape of the languages that you have because of the encounter that you are having between them, you know what I mean? Like you can bring things back from a language that your language does differently, has a different shape for. And in doing so, maybe you change both of them. But anyway, I was just nodding because I was saying yes, what you said.
What would you say the shape of Italian is?
And I think I'm the wrong person to say. I'm not madrelingua. But I guess what I could say, maybe this is revealing that when I cross borders into countries where I speak the languages, and I don't speak many languages, sometimes people say to me, you not only like you changed into Italian, you were speaking French, and now you're speaking Italian, but you changed the whole way that you speak, So like when I speak, I'm sure this is true for many multilingual people in the room, it's not just you change the words, you also change the gestures, you also change, the facial expressions, you also change, the kinds of things that you would say. So there's like I don't know if that doesn't answer your question, but it feels like not just an embodied change or a linguistic change, but a change of the shape of your self appearing,
Yeah.
I was going to say esprimere, anyway, expressing yourself.
Yeah, like a magic trick. I love that.
Yeah.
We've got time for one more question. There's someone who'd like to raise something? I've got one more question which I'm curious about. Obviously nowadays everything is very online, everything is, mediated through on social media. How would you advise, people who are listening to this now, learning about the community that Sibilla, raised herself as a writer and as a woman in? How do you think they can find those communities in their own life? How do you seek them out?
Can I let someone else go first?
Xiaolu.
You go first.
Okay.
Brava.
I think that's a difficult question because personally, in theory, social media would be a great possibility to find communities, but I think it's what we are experiencing is that as easily as it could create communities, it can actually create a lot of divisive violence. And I think that's like the prevailing factor. I think so many people are using social media just as a means to, take out their frustration on people, just targeting people. And I think it's becoming really dangerous. So I think it's useful to start thinking about how really creating communities, not necessarily through the obvious ways. So maybe going back to what we were saying before, things like this, like today, like things where it's gonna be people like you, so creating spaces of people that are similar, that, and I don't mean similar in a banal way, you know, just people that you know are on your same wavelengths, and because social media is just one huge, you know, bucket where everything just falls, and it's a known place. So how can you find a community inside a known place where there's so much violence, where everything is together without any you know, way to distinguish, because that's the main thing. Our people are supposed to find communities and count those, you know, friendship and affection in such a bucket of all sorts of things, you know, sort of bullshit mixed with information, mixed with violence, you know what I mean?
Yeah, fake news. Xiaolu, I love what you said about, you know, you have these books on your bedside table, and it's almost like you form this community of writers who have, you know, in some cases been dead a long time ago. You know, how did you come to collect all these people together? How did you realize this is what resonates with me? I'm forming a community in my head with all these writers who came before me.
I think, you know, maybe make it very simple, which is a brutal way to do it, you know, when talk about very complex literary work. But they're all about ontological, this deep, disastrous ontological question, you know, who is this person, who am I, and what I would become. And I think a lot of stuff is becoming yourself. And this is one of my favorite original Russian, European, German psychoanalyst called Lo Salome, who was associated with Nietzsche, and she was Freud's student. And you know, her life is about becoming Salome. And this is, I think, the key. Virginia Woolf tried to become a woman who can write independently, or all those, you know, writers I mentioned, and including this book, Una Donna. And I think, I mean, come back to the question of social media, you know, I try not to be too negative. In a way, in some other countries, social media is very, it's the only place maybe the censorship wouldn't arrive immediately yet. And given someone from China, and I understand, you know, certain stuff in Europe, in the West, is so you take for granted. But it's not the case. In a lot of countries, we can't access BBC even, you know, Google, you know, doesn't exist in China. So I think I try to look at it differently. Is our visual expression has revolutionized itself through the social media, through the camera, rather than we stay in this traditional text-based verbal expression. And I can't say, you know, all the rubbish coming out from the visualized social media. I don't think so. And I think is the way of expression so much changed from traditional text-based literary work. It's just like John Burgess said, you know, the camera, the color camera photograph arrived, somehow replaced this excessive need of oil painting. And maybe it's not true, but invention of the camera has really revolutionized our expression. So we move away from the traditional painting literary work. But I think the spirit, the questioning of who am I, this ontological quest, is still the key for every single expression, you know, including the very superficial social media.
Yeah, no matter who you are, what gender you are, it always boils down to that idea. If Sibilla was born today and alive today, would she be on